Why babies need meat. I didn't think this would be controversial. To me, it was obvious that babies would need meat. But when we started the meat-based baby food company, this was one of the most common questions was, well, when can babies eat meat? Why do babies need meat? Do babies really need meat? And so we became experts on this topic. So I want to give you the kind of three major reasons that babies need meat. It is the most nutrient-dense food on the planet. There is no more nutrition per ounce of any kind of food than you will find in meat and animal products. Vitamins, minerals, protein, fat, critical nutrients, ounce for ounce, the most dense in a piece of meat. But ultimately, even factory farm meat has more nutrition in it than the best organic raised vegetable or legume like beans or grains or any of that. And so with babies, they need a lot of nutrition. Their spine's doubling in the first year of life. Their brain is rapidly developing. Their body's growing really big. So they need a ton of nutrition. We want to focus on the most nutrient dense foods possible to feed that growth. And meat's super digestible. You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father. We are dedicated. So first of all, first foods are transitioning a baby from breast milk or from formula, which happens about 6 months old. I have a whole episode on that. So if you're interested in learning about how to do first foods, all the feeding tips for parents, check out that one. But this one specifically on meat. So they're transitioning from breast milk. So digestibility is huge. They're figuring out how to digest solid foods for the first time. So foods that are super digestible are important for them because you don't want them throwing up. You don't want really nasty blowout poops. None of that stuff's fun for you or fun for them. Plus you're trying to get nutrition into them. So if they're throwing it up or it's like going right through them, it doesn't help. So we're looking at what's the most digestible for babies. And my wife did an incredible amount of research on this. Everything from the USDA's guide for infant feeding to the most extreme paleo functional medicine bloggers, right? Everything in between. They were all very clear that the science is very clear on what's digestible for babies. So breast milk is the model. The foods most similar to breast milk are the most digestible, and that is animal products. Breast milk is an animal product. I like to call it a free-range animal product. And therefore, other animal products like eggs and meat and bone broth are super digestible for babies. Cow's milk, not so much. It's a little bit strange. You would think that it would be a lot like regular milk, but really when they first start foods, they should still be doing formula and breast milk. And so that's kind of all the milk they really need. So when we're adding in solid foods, we're trying to get that variety. And not every baby loves cow's milk and not every person can digest cow's milk. So but meat and eggs, bone broth, those are all really great foods that are very similar to breast milk in that they're the body breaking down animal nutrition. Cooked vegetables, especially starchy veggies, are also pretty easy to digest. You wouldn't want to give them a ton of greens. We put a teeniest bit of kale and spinach in some of our blends, but you wouldn't give them a lot of greens, and you wouldn't give them raw veggies quite yet. And you would stay away from grains. Grains are the least digestible. Even to adults, grains are not super digestible. But meat, very digestible. So it's easy for the baby to absorb. So second reason meat's great for first food is it is the most nutrient-dense food on the planet. There is no more nutrition per ounce of any kind of food than you will find in meat and animal products. Vitamins, minerals, protein, fat, critical nutrients, ounce for ounce, the most dense in a piece of meat. You get well-sourced meat like grass-fed meat or generatively raised meat, pasture-raised meat. It's even better. There's even more nutrition packed in there. But ultimately, even factory farm meat has more nutrition in it than the best organic raised vegetable or legume like beans or grains or any of that. There's still more actual nutrition. I like to say the worst meat has more nutrition than the best vegetable because it's just so packed full of nutrition for us. And so with babies, they need a lot of nutrition. Their spine's doubling in the first year of life. Their brain is rapidly developing. Their body's growing really big. So they need a ton of nutrition. And so we want to focus on the most nutrient-dense foods possible to feed that growth. And meat's super digestible. Another reason people don't realize a lot is how much fat babies need. Fat is the building blocks of the brain. It's critical for their spine development. It's critical for vitamin absorption. A lot of vitamins are fat soluble, meaning if there's not fat with the vitamin, it won't get absorbed. There's a lot of water soluble vitamins as well, but like a lot of critical vitamins need fat to be absorbed. And babies need 30 grams of fat a day, according to the USDA. And that is a lot of fat. I mean, if you multiply that for a 15-pound baby to a 150-pound adult, that's an incredible amount of fat. It's something like half the calories of their diet till age 2 should be from fat. Don't quote me exactly on that, but that's a good way to think about it. Like it's a lot of fat that they need. And the breast milk is half fat, right? It's about half fat, half carbs with some protein. And so fat is critical, especially saturated fat, because that's the most absorbable, most like breast milk, which is a lot of saturated fat. And the best source of saturated fat is meat, right? You get really good meat fat. So we use very fatty cuts of meat in our products. We use 80% ground beef. We use chicken thighs. We use fatty pork, cuts of pork, salmon, right? And then we also add olive oil into our blends to boost the fat even more, which is another really great saturated fat. And so the fat is critical, and meat's just a really convenient way to get a lot of really good fat in there. Couple other things I'll mention are iron. Babies are naturally iron deficient for some reason, or at least that's what the pediatricians say, that they need more iron. I'm not an expert on why they're iron deficient, but ultimately everybody says you need to really focus on iron-rich foods. And there's a specific kind of iron called heme iron, which is the most absorbable, most important kind of iron. It's only found in animal products. There's some iron in greens, and you can supplement with synthetic iron if you want, though there's some issues with that. But like ultimately that heme iron in meat and animal products is super critical. And so it's another really important reason. Another one I'll mention is the flavor window, which is between the ages of 6 months and 18 months, they are forming their palates. So this is if you give them a lot of sweet tasting foods like fruits and other sweet stuff during this time, it can taint their palate to prefer sweet and lead to sugar addiction, diabetes, obesity, so forth. There's scientific studies proving this, that like early exposure to sugars and sweets in excess can lead to these other problems in life. Whereas if you expose them to savory flavors like sours and umamis and bitters early, their palate learns to enjoy a whole variety of foods. And then that has also been proven to lead to healthier eating later in life because they've have a more diverse palate. So meat is a really great way to expose them to very different flavors than sweets, right? The meat is almost never sweet. You've got savory flavors, you've got like fatty, meaty flavors, you've got umamis in there. We make a lot of blends with spices and herbs, like our World Explorers line or our bone broth line or our meat and herbs line, to help expose babies to different herb flavors, salmon, bison, so forth. These are really critical flavors. And so our daughter ate a lot of meat and a lot of bone broth. I'll also put the link to our bone broth, liver bone broth recipe. My wife would blend liver with bone broth and then strain it out and put it in a bottle. So this was, of course, after 6 months. And so she would supplement. It was like breast milk, some formula, bone broth, and then meat and veggies as she got bigger, and then a lot of Serenity Kids purees. This bone broth is great, and it tastes really livery, and so that really taught her mouth to enjoy those flavors. And she's still Drinks a lot of bone broth. She loves bone broth. She loves green olives. It's one of her most favorite foods, green and black olives. She loves those strong, salty flavors. She loves salty meat flavors. So she loves, hot dogs and sliced turkey and brisket and hamburgers, chicken thighs. Loves fat, loves butter. We'll eat, but still to this day, we'll eat butter by the spoonful, which is actually quite healthy, especially for babies. Just let them eat butter, non-stick of butter, avocado, things like that. And then eggs. She loves eggs. And so those are all great first foods. Egg white, egg yolk, or like the whole egg cooked is really easy for babies to eat. Bone broth is great because it's liquid. Liver as early as you can. A lot of people will put chunks of liver in the freezer, and if you freeze it for 15 days, it's super safe to feed raw, and then they'll let the baby chew on it raw as like a teether. They're getting nutrition, they're getting the flavor, they're getting the frozen experience. You can also just mix liver into their food. Liver is, I talk about meat being the most nutrient dense. Liver is the absolutely most nutrient dense food. I mean, that is literally nature's multivitamin. A tiny little chunk of liver has like so many vitamins and minerals that are critical. It just kind of doesn't taste great. So giving it to babies when they are forming their palates is a great time to do that. There's lots of different ways to prepare meat for babies. Our purees are a super convenient way to do it. There's a 15% off discount code in the show notes, code dedicated15 on myserendykids.com if you want to order those foods for your baby. But just in general, think, meat first, veggies second. Meat and veggies are critical. Weight on grains, weight on sugars and processed foods. There'll be plenty of time for them to eat those. But for now, get the meat in there. Happy feeding. Share this with a family that is undergoing the first food time. Let us know what kind of animal products your baby really likes in the comments. And please follow this channel because it really helps me reach more dads. Appreciate that, and stay dedicated.